Welcome to part 5 of my video series, How to Make a Slim Tower. First, I'd like to give a very brief apology for taking so long to make this video. Before we get to the final phases of installing the middle edge pieces onto our core, what I'd like to do is I'd like to mention one last thing that I forgot to mention last time, which will be kind of important, and that is that on a standard keychain core, one of the things I noticed was that the center caps, the center pieces here, tend to stick up a little bit farther than the rest of the surrounding pieces. Now, generally speaking, for a puzzle like this, it's not a big deal, but the problem is when you're attempting to align the core, the middle edge pieces to the core, I noticed that it makes it a little bit harder if this is kind of sticking out. You know, bumps up about, I don't know, a quarter millimeter or so. To get rid of that, really simple. All you need to do is sand this down, sand the center core down, you know, with a piece of sandpaper, layer paper down flat, strip the cube until it's just down to the core mechanism, somewhat like this. And then just take your sandpaper, give it a few rubs, and you know, just get the level down a little bit. You don't have to do too much, and just, you know, depending on your grit, just takes a few strokes. But I highly recommend you do that just so that this piece will lay flat when it's on top of something, so it lays flat. I'll demonstrate a little bit later. I didn't sand mine too much, so you'll see what I mean by that. And again, I'm just making this a little bit harder on myself than I need to make it, but that's for demonstration purposes so that you can see where I make my mistakes so you don't make them. Now, as I was saying earlier about the core needing to lay flat, the reason you want it to lay flat, you'll notice here with this particular core, let me make sure it's lined up nicely. Now, the reason you want it to lay flat is because if the core is resting on your piece of wood, normally it sits okay, but when you add a little extra weight, what ends up happening is that it kind of flops a little bit. The reason it flops is because the center pieces tend to stick up a little bit, about a quarter of a millimeter, and that's why, again, you want to sand both of these cores down. And again, like I said earlier in this video, I left mine essentially unsanded, but that's again to illustrate that it really is not that difficult to work around, but it is something you have to keep in mind if you want to make sure that your edges are straight. Now, the reason again we're using a hard board like this is that these pieces have to rest flat, because they will be your guide for making sure that the middle edge is perfectly lined up. It needs to cut down right down the middle of that puzzle on one side or the other. Now, again, we're not really worrying about it right at this point, whether it's perfectly aligned against the center piece there, essentially meaning that it could be a little bit off like that or a little bit inwards like that. Right now, we don't care. What we're really interested in is making sure that here, through this point, these two middle edges are perfectly lined up. That's all we're really going to worry about, which is what I'm doing here. And again, if you do this right, see, I'm just holding on that cube with my finger here. If we do this right, just like that, and we look on the side, we can see it's perfectly aligned. We're good to go. So right now you're saying, well, what is the purpose of what I'm doing right now? Well, really there is no purpose. You see, right this moment all I did was give you sort of a dry run of what we're going to be doing to get this piece in the middle there. Why a dry run? Well, because now it's time to go ahead and use some adhesive to get these middle edges stuck into position just like that. And how do we do that? What are we going to use? Well, we're going to use epoxy putty. So let's put our putty to use. I mixed up a small little batch ahead of time. Well, not really. You didn't notice the big long cut. All I'm going to do is take a little bit of my putty. In this case, epoxy sculpt, the natural color. I do it so that it's a little bit easier to see, and plus I'm going to use these pieces later. Now I probably don't want to use black. Not that it really matters, you really can't see it, but if you shine a light through it, never mind. Never mind. Alright, so little bottle of putty in there. Little ball of putty on the other side. Like so. So now the idea is that these two will get pushed in to the puzzle just like that. And as they get pushed in, making sure that everything else is aligned, these pieces will stay in place until they cure. Now bear in mind that what I'm doing now needs to be reversed. You don't want to let it cure too long. You want to let it cure long enough, but not too long. And I'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and take a bit of a gamble here. Close enough. Close enough. And my guide, post-it notes. This piece slides in. Steady. Now again, the epoxy putty, or epoxy putty, I'll just call it putty. The putty is soft enough to where it will squeeze into place slowly. However, remember that although it's very soft and squishable, malleable, it is not elastic. So what you do not want to do is start backing out from what you've already done. Now again, you're thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. If the epoxy putty cures really hard like a rock, then how am I going to worry about the pieces whose alignment I'm messing up here? And obviously I'm not centering it along this pole, I'm only centering it here. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let me make sure I got mine perfectly aligned. So that's pretty good. Just going to move this piece. Alright, that's good. Well, my camera stopped recording there for a moment, so let me just explain what it is that I was in the middle of doing. Now, basically the pieces had been aligned using our post-it notes again. And remember, the outside ones, they don't have to be post-it notes. They can be, you know, small pieces of plastic, blocks of wood, whatever. I like using post-it notes. It gives me a little bit of give, a little bit of flexibility. So once we had this piece aligned, we wanted to make sure, of course, that these post-it notes gave us our alignment for the center core. Both the pieces being perfectly straight up and down, essentially this way, so that they are not crooked. Like if this was the piece, you wouldn't want the piece to sit crooked like this. You would want it to be perfectly straight. And like I said, we're not too worried about these pieces here being perfectly centered here. And what I was about to explain was that, well, you have to let the putty dry long enough for it to remain hard, yet not so long that you can't remove it, because when this stuff dries, you know, it gets hard as a rock. So how do you do that? Well, this is how. See, I left myself a lump of the epoxy sculpt.